In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to utilize the displacement features found within RealFlow's meshes. Okay, so for this scene, I have just a very simple hybrido domain that's been set up, as well as a simple cube here that is being used as an emitter. So we have this very nice flat system of particles here. So I do have a grid mesh that has been set up. So if I were to come in here, right-click, and build this, you can see here's our surface. You can see, again, very nice and flat. We're going to use this as a way of actually seeing just what we can start to accomplish with some of the displacement effects found within this mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and select my domain, and underneath the surface, this is where we were actually able to control things like the actual mesh resolution and things like that. Now just below this, we have our displacement settings. So if I were to go ahead and expand this, first off, we have our calculate displacement. You can see right now it's set to never. So if I were to set this to always, at first you'll notice that nothing really happens. Now, in order to actually see this displacement effect, we actually need to go back to the mesh itself and adjust some of the actual display settings. So let's select the mesh. Let's go ahead and go down to shader. Under the shader type where it's set to none, let's set this now to displacement. And we'll make sure that the source is set to the domain. So that way, all of the displacement settings that I plug in back in the actual domain should be instantly reflected now back in the shader. So you can see once we set this to this displacement shader that we actually kind of get this really nice water type shading along our surface. And we can start to get some really nice believable waves with just simply the displacements on this flat surface. So let's start with something like our auto depth. Now, for most situations, I find that this is actually just fine to go ahead and leave this set to yes. Essentially, what this is going to do is automatically allow RealFlow to calculate just how deep this surface is, and really kind of calculate just how the waves need to look based on that depth. Again, for most situations, I find that this is going to be just fine set to yes. Now below this, we have our vertical scale. Now this is really controlling just how high these displacement effects are going to be. So if I were to set this up to a little bit higher value, something like 0.5, you can see where, as long as we can see these displacement effects through this shader, you can see that, again, now these raised areas become much stronger and much more pronounced. So again, just really depending on the actual look that you're trying to go for, we can start to get very wide variety of appearances here. Now we also have this auto dimension. Now this is something that you may want to come in and actually make some adjustments to. Essentially, with this auto dimension set to yes, RealFlow will automatically determine sort of how large of an area of water we're looking at. So again, taking into account that each one of these grid units is about 1 meter in length, you can see that we're looking at really something that's probably not going to be much bigger than a decent-sized swimming pool full of water. But if we wanted to actually simulate something that was maybe a very large lake or a large open ocean in this same area, obviously our waves are going to look much different in this very large body of water with very small waves. So what we can start to do is take this auto dimension, we'll set that to no, and let's say again I wanted this to look, instead of like a small swimming pool, something like a very large open ocean. So now I can start to take my dimension and begin bringing this up. So maybe something like 100 or even higher, depending on what kind of a look I want to go for. Now at the moment, with this dimension starting to increase, you can see it really doesn't do much for us. It really just kind of makes this look much more turbulent, much more chaotic. Again, not very realistic. Now to fix this, one of the best things that you can do is start to increase your wind speed. So with the wind speed set very low, it actually produces these very strong turbulent effects. But as we start to bring this wind speed up, maybe to something like 10, now we can start to see something that is much more realistic. And again, this will look very different depending on our dimension. So with this set to 200, this looks like a very large open body of water. But if I were to set my dimension maybe back to something like 20, we can start to see where this behaves a little bit more like a small little container of water with larger ripples. And again, if we maybe wanted these to be a little bit stronger, we can start to take things like our vertical scale and begin increasing this. So these waves now start to stand up a little bit higher. Now, at the moment, you can start to see where my displacement is now a little bit stronger, so we can actually start to see some of these particles pushing through. So what I'm going to do is just take this domain, select that, and just set it to be invisible, so that way it's not getting in the way. Now, in addition to our wind speed, we can also start to control our wind direction. So with this set to a degree of 0, it's essentially blowing straight along these x-axes. So what we should be able to do is introduce maybe a certain amount of orientation or rotation to that, so we can rotate the wind direction around about 45 degrees, or really any direction that we want. So if we wanted that to blow from a completely different direction, that should be very, very easy to control. Now, further down, we have one of the newer features that is in RealFlow 2012, and this is the ability to now introduce white caps into these displacement effects. So if I start to introduce these white caps, I'll set that to yes. By default, you'll see that nothing happens. That's because there's two very, very important options we need to make sure are turned on in order to actually see this effect. The first one is choppiness. So without any sort of chop in the water, we're obviously not going to have any kind of white caps in reality. The same is true within RealFlow. So if we start to introduce a little bit of choppiness, and it really doesn't matter just what this value is, as long as it's something greater than 0, we should now start to see these white caps appear. The other very important factor in order to actually see these white caps is not only do we have to have choppiness, we also need to have some measure of wind speed. So if your wind speed is set to 0, obviously again with no wind, you have no choppiness, and with no choppiness, we get no white caps. Now, again, these white caps can look very, very different depending on our actual dimension. So again, with this being a very small container of water, we start to get these kind of very large, really not very detailed white caps. But if we start to, again, bump this up to where we are simulating something a little bit larger, as far as the overall body of water is concerned, we should now start to see, as we begin bringing this up, some more kind of spread out white cap patterns in here. Now, if you look, you can see that my texture seems actually a little bit stretched. You can see that our waves are stretching very, very heavily in this direction. Now, the reason for this is that whenever RealFlow is generating these displacement maps, it's actually generating a square displacement. Now, in our case, you can see that this is definitely not a square shape. This is a very, very heavily stretched rectangle. So what we can do, in order to just make this a little bit more visually appealing within our viewport, we can start to increase the number of repeat U or repeat V. So in my case, I'll go ahead and take the repeat V and set that to something like 2. And now we can actually see something that is a little bit less stretched out in the viewport. Now this won't make any change whatsoever to the actual displacement map. Essentially what it's done is now just taken the displacement map and now just tiled it twice. But again, the actual displacement map that we write out will be absolutely unaffected by this change. This is just really for strictly viewport visualization purposes. So looking at this, again, in this case might start to get a little bit too strong as far as our overall waves here. So a few different things we can do. We can sometimes start to take this wind speed and actually begin increasing this. And oddly enough, as we start to increase this wind speed, it can sometimes start to smooth things out a little bit more. Another thing that we can also start to do is, if we don't want to increase that wind speed, we can also sometimes just start to increase this dimension as well. And again, simulate something that looks like a little bit more open, larger body of water. Again, sometimes these different effects, the dimension and the wind speed, sometimes kind of work together in order to give us our final result. So just coming in and sort of playing with these until you find the value that is right for you. Now, looking at these white caps, we may come in and decide maybe we want these to be a little bit stronger. So if we actually want these to appear more visibly within our viewport, what we can do is actually go back to the mesh itself, scroll up, and we have our white cap threshold. So with a lower value, this starts to cut away more of our white caps. So if I start to bring this down to 0.1, you can see our white caps have almost entirely disappeared. Likewise, if I were to bring this up to 0.8 or even higher, up to something like 1, now we can actually see all of the white caps that we have here. So coming in here and starting to bump this down to maybe something like 0.6 or 0.7, just so that this is a little bit stronger in our viewport, can really help things out. Now, again, this is one of these options that is really not affecting the actual displacement map itself. This is entirely just controlling the actual display of that whitecap information within the viewport. So another thing that we have in here within the actual domain is, if we scroll down, we can come in here and start to control this displacement quality. So if I were to come in a little bit closer, we can start to see, obviously, this very, very strong pixelization in this whitecap map. So if we were to come in and maybe switch this up to something like 1024, you can start to see once we switch this, now it's going to take a little bit longer to calculate, but now we do have some much more detailed whitecap patterns in here. And again, we can take this up actually all the way up to an 8K map. Just keep in mind that as you start to increase this quality, the calculation of these maps starts to really, really slow down. So I would recommend not setting this up to a very high value until you pretty much have everything looking the way you want. Then you can come in, set up your quality, and then do your final displacement map export. So typically when I'm in my early stages of setting this up, I really don't like to go any higher than a 512, and sometimes to really speed things along, I'll maybe drop this down to a 256. You can see it will calculate almost instantly at that point. Okay, so once we have this set up, we can then just simply come in and run our simulation. So if I press the A key on my keyboard and let this simulate through for a few frames. Alright, so you can see once this is finished up, that we should now be able to come in here and scrub through this and actually see what our animation looks like. So you can see we have this really, really nice appearance of this very large, open, kind of turbulent ocean. And again, this is all being controlled exclusively by this displacement map. Now, as we were going through our simulation, not only was the mesh being written out, but also the displacement map information. So if I were to take a look inside the actual project file for this, if we take a look inside our displacement, you can see, again, for every single frame, we wind up with our own displacement map. So you can see if I were to open this up, here's our displacement information. And again, if we were able to open this up in something that would let us actually open up the entire sequence, we should be able to come in and actually see, again, this animated displacement map. So we can come in here and play this back, and you can see what this entire displacement sequence looks like. So you're probably wondering that now we have this displacement map information out, what about the actual whitecap information? How do we actually take this out as a map to be rendered? Well, what's really nice is the fact that this whitecap map is actually contained directly inside of the displacement. Now we can see this if we take a look at our displacement's alpha channel. Now you can actually see here is the whitecap information. So essentially what we would need to do is take this texture back into our 3D application and use some sort of a clamp or some kind of a texture modulation to actually trim away some of these lower areas and just leave these high points of our whitecap map. And really the exact process and the workflow that you use is going to be just a little bit different depending on which 3D application you're actually going back into. But the fact is that this is really nice that we can come in and now just take this displacement map, and again, if you recall, this is just a flat mesh. So we could take this displacement, drop it onto just a completely flat plane in our 3D application, and we'll get this wave distortion that looks exactly like this. Okay, so this will now bring us to the conclusion of this Introduction to RealFlow course. Now, throughout this course, we've had a chance to look over many of the tools and some of the major features of RealFlow, really with the goal of just helping you to understand just what these features are and how they actually work. Now, the fact is that we've just barely scratched the surface of what RealFlow is truly capable of doing. So to continue your RealFlow education, Digital Tutors actually has lots of additional training courses that will give you a much more in-depth look into many of the tools and features that you've been introduced to during this training. So be sure to check out all of the additional RealFlow training courses that we have available at digitaltutors.com.